North Carolina is the longest state east of the Mississippi, roughly 560 miles from the Outer Banks to the far western mountains. Within that narrow strip, the land rises from sea level to the highest peak east of the Mississippi, passing through coastal marshes, rolling Piedmont, and summits with a climate closer to Canada than to Carolina. But the geography isn't what makes this state the opposite of every other. It's what the geography did to the people. Three completely different Americas, crammed into one narrow strip, forced to share a government. And the result is a state that industrialized while the rest of the South picked cotton, built a world-class research corridor inside the Bible Belt, and elected polar political opposites at the same time for decades. The land made the contradiction. The people made it permanent. To understand how North Carolina became the opposite of everything, you have to start with what the land decided long before anyone arrived. North Carolina stretches roughly 560 miles east to west, but less than 190 miles north to south. That ratio alone makes it unusual, a long, thin band of land squeezed between the Atlantic and the Appalachian crest. But the real surprise is what's packed inside that band. On the eastern edge, the land barely exists above water. Sea-level marshes and shifting barrier islands line a coast that spends half the year waiting for the next hurricane. The soil is sandy, the rivers are slow, and the ground is so flat that water has nowhere to go when the rain falls hard. Drive a few hours west and everything changes. The rolling red clay Piedmont rises through tobacco fields and pine forests, cut by rivers that actually move. The ground here is firm, the elevation modest, the terrain made for building. Keep driving west, and the land transforms again. The Blue Ridge Escarpment climbs sharply into the Appalachians, reaching Mount Mitchell at 6,684 feet, the highest point east of the Mississippi. The forests up there are spruce and fir, not magnolia and live oak. The climate and ecology are closer to the Canadian Highlands than to the humid lowlands a few hours south. A single week can bring mountain snow, Piedmont thunderstorms, and coastal flooding simultaneously. The western mountains are so disconnected from the state capital that some communities receive Tennessee or Georgia television news more readily than anything from Raleigh. This isn't just regional variety, it's three separate Americas stitched together by a single state border. And because the geography created separate worlds, those worlds immediately clashed, even before America was a country. The internal tension didn't start recently. It is baked into North Carolina's colonial DNA. While coastal planters built a miniature version of Virginia's tobacco aristocracy, complete with enslaved labor, tidewater wealth, and political connections to the crown, backcountry farmers in the western hills were building something very different. They were poor, isolated, Scots, Irish, and German settlers who had no say in how the colony was governed and no patience for the corrupt eastern officials who taxed them without accountability. In the late 1760s, those backcountry farmers launched the Regulator Movement, an armed uprising against Eastern power that ended in a violent clash at Alamance Creek in 1771, years before the American Revolution. The colonial governor crushed the regulators, but the grievance didn't disappear. It just went underground and waited. That populist streak resurfaced when the Civil War came. North Carolina was the last state to join the Confederacy, dragged in only after Fort Sumter forced a choice. And even then, the western mountains harbored substantial Unionist sentiment. Entire communities refused to support the Confederate cause. Desertion rates from North Carolina troops were among the highest in the South. The state that fought for the Confederacy didn't fully believe in the cause it was fighting for. From the very beginning, North Carolina contained a fundamental disagreement with itself. Coastal elites pulling one direction, mountain populists pulling another, and the Piedmont stuck in between trying to hold it all together. That internal tug-of-war would have kept the state poor and fractured forever, except that one of the three regions found something no other southern state had. Here is where North Carolina breaks from every other southern state. While the rest of the South stayed locked in agriculture well into the 20th century, dependent on cotton, sharecropping, and a plantation economy that resisted change, North Carolina industrialized. Textile mills sprang up along the Piedmont's rivers. Tobacco factories processed the state's biggest cash crop. Furniture plants turned hardwood forests into household goods shipped across the country. Between the 1880s and the early 1900s, the Piedmont built a manufacturing economy that had no equivalent below the Mason-Dixon line. How a single region broke from the entire South comes down to geography. And if that's the kind of story you want to keep seeing, subscribe. Then came the Great Migration of American industry. Between 1923 and 1933, New England textile production collapsed by roughly 40%. That production didn't vanish. It moved south, chasing cheaper labor, lower taxes, and rivers that could power the looms. North Carolina caught the bulk of it. The Piedmont's geography was ideal. Rivers for power, rail connections to move product, flat land to build on, and a workforce willing to accept wages that New England mills could no longer afford to pay. But this wasn't just an economic shift. Industrialization changed who North Carolinians were. A state full of factory workers, shift supervisors, and small business owners doesn't think like a state full of sharecroppers and plantation heirs. The mill towns of the Piedmont developed a middle class and a pragmatic, business-first political culture that would have been unrecognizable in Mississippi or Alabama. Workers joined unions or fought them. Owners negotiated with banks and railroads. Mill villages grew up around the factories with company houses, company stores, and a rhythm of life dictated by the factory whistle rather than the harvest calendar. Children grew up hearing looms clatter, not mules bray. The culture shifted from land to labor, from patience to productivity. And then, when the rest of the South was still fighting over the past, North Carolina was already building something new and earning a reputation as the South's exception. That pragmatic streak led to one of the boldest economic experiments in American history, one that changed the state's trajectory permanently. In 1959, business and university leaders did something no southern state had attempted. They carved a research park out of pine forest between Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill, 3 cities that each held a major university. The idea was simple and audacious. Use the combined intellectual firepower of the University of North Carolina, Duke University, and North Carolina State to attract knowledge economy firms that would never otherwise set foot in the South. It worked. IBM came. Chemstrand came. Federal research dollars followed. The state that had been mocked as Rip Van Winkle, a sleepy backwater even by Southern standards, reinvented itself as a magnet for technology, biotech, and pharmaceutical research. Research Triangle Park became the proof that a southern state could compete on brains, not just cheap labor. Charlotte, following the same business-first logic that had defined the Piedmont for decades, grew into the country's second-largest banking center after New York. But Research Triangle Park didn't just bring jobs. It brought people from outside the South, people with different assumptions about politics, education, and race. Engineers from New Jersey, researchers from California, managers from the Midwest who had never set foot below the Mason-Dixon line and had no intention of adopting its customs. The influx collided with a state that still carried deep conservative currents in its rural counties and small towns, places where church attendance defined community standing, where family roots mattered more than diplomas, and where change was viewed with suspicion by default. 2 North Carolinas were now growing simultaneously. A cosmopolitan, research-driven Piedmont corridor where newcomers outnumbered natives in some neighborhoods, and a traditional, culturally conservative periphery that watched the transformation with equal parts envy and suspicion. The new arrivals saw progress. The old guard saw erasure. Both were partially right. The very success of the New South model guaranteed that North Carolina's politics would become a battleground. And that battleground produced something American politics had never seen before. A state that elected polar opposites at the exact same time. In 1984, North Carolina staged what was then the most expensive non-presidential contest in American history. Over $25 million spent on a single Senate race. On one side stood Jesse Helms, one of the most hardline conservative senators in modern American history. Helms had been elected 5 times, built a national fundraising machine, and become a godfather of the new right. He opposed civil rights legislation, foreign aid, and virtually every social program that crossed his desk. His supporters adored him. His opponents considered him dangerous. On the other side, running for governor in overlapping election cycles was Jim Hunt, a pro-education, pro-business Democrat who embodied the moderate New South ideal. Hunt championed public schools, courted corporate investment, and projected exactly the kind of pragmatic centrism that Research Triangle Park was built to represent. Here is the part that baffles anyone who looks at North Carolina from the outside. Voters didn't choose between these visions, they chose both. The same electorate that sent Helms to Washington sent Hunt to Raleigh. This wasn't confusion, it was the geographic logic of the state made visible. Mountain conservatives, Piedmont moderates, coastal traditionalists, and new arrivals from the research corridor all pulled the lever in the same election, producing a result that looked like a contradiction, but was actually the honest expression of a state that contains every American political impulse at once. No other state did this. North Carolina didn't swing between left and right, it held both positions simultaneously, like a tuning fork vibrating at two frequencies. The same geography that crammed three Americas into one strip crammed every political argument into one ballot. But the contradictions weren't just political. The state wrote something into its constitution that almost no other state dared to, and then contradicted it on the very same page. North Carolina's 1971 state constitution includes a provision that most Americans would be surprised to learn exists. Article 1, Section 15 declares that the people have a right to the privilege of education, and that it is the duty of the state to guard and maintain that right. Read that again. Not a privilege granted by legislators, not a goal to work toward when budgets allow. A right guaranteed in the state's founding document with language strong enough to give courts the legal grounds to intervene in school funding and equity in ways most state judiciaries cannot. North Carolina's Constitution essentially treats education the way the Federal Bill of Rights treats speech. In a region where public schools have historically been underfunded and undervalued, that guarantee is extraordinary. But the same Constitution carries provisions and practices rooted in post-Reconstruction efforts to limit black political power. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and gerrymandered districts all found their justification in legal frameworks the state built over decades. Progressive guarantees and regressive legacies written into the same document, a single text pulling in opposite directions, promising equality while preserving structures designed to prevent it. The Constitution is the state in miniature, bold in one article, contradictory in the next. And the contradictions don't stop at law. They are written into the physical land itself. North Carolina's barrier islands are among the most dynamic coastlines in America. The Outer Banks shift, erode, and rebuild themselves with every storm season. Inlets open and close on the scale of decades. The sand moves constantly, pushed by wind and tide, building new ground in one place while swallowing it in another. In 1999, engineers attempted something that captured the absurdity of building permanence on a coast that refuses to stay put. They moved the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, roughly 5,000 tons of brick and iron, nearly 2,900 feet inland over 23 days. The Atlantic had eaten the shoreline out from under the structure. Waves that once broke hundreds of feet from the base were lapping at its foundation. It was one of the largest building relocations ever attempted, forced by a coastline that treats human construction as temporary. That same year, Hurricane Floyd dumped 20 inches of rain on the coastal plain, turning the flat, slow rivers into vast inland seas. The flooding killed dozens of people and caused billions of dollars in damage. A disaster amplified by the very low gradient that usually makes those rivers look placid and harmless. The geography that makes the coast beautiful is exactly what makes it catastrophically vulnerable. But this isn't just a coastal problem. The Piedmont corridor that drives North Carolina's economy depends on a reputation as a stable, welcoming place to do business. Climate projections threaten the entire model. Every major hurricane season tests whether the state can hold the contradiction together: growth and vulnerability, ambition and exposure, all packed into the same narrow strip. And if the physical ground is unstable, it should come as no surprise that the political ground is too. In 2016, the state legislature passed HB 2, the so-called bathroom bill restricting transgender access to public facilities. The backlash was immediate and devastating. Corporations pulled investments. The NBA moved its all-star game out of Charlotte. PayPal canceled a planned operations center that would have brought hundreds of jobs. The moderate, business-friendly image that North Carolina had spent decades building cracked overnight. But here is the deeper paradox. The same political system that produced Research Triangle Park and Charlotte's banking boom also produced HB2. Both outcomes are authentic expressions of North Carolina's internal tension. The state's economic model depends on appearing moderate and welcoming, the kind of place where global companies feel comfortable investing billions. Its political geography guarantees that conservative rural and exurban districts hold substantial legislative power. Those two facts are on a collision course, and HB2 was the moment the collision became visible to the rest of the country. North Carolina's future depends on whether the contradiction that made it successful can survive the pressures now pulling it apart. The Piedmont corridor needs global credibility. The rural periphery needs cultural recognition. And the geography that forces them into the same state ensures that neither side can simply walk away from the argument. North Carolina looks like a normal southern state until you realize it contains every American argument compressed into 500 miles. Mountain populists who rebelled before the Revolution. Factory workers in a region of sharecroppers. A research corridor that rivals Silicon Valley inside a state that elected Jesse Helms 5 times. A constitution that guarantees education as a right while carrying the fingerprints of voter suppression. A coastline that literally moves under your feet. Most states pick a lane. North Carolina runs every lane at once. That's not a flaw, it's the design. The geography forced it. 3 Americas, 1 border, no room to separate. North Carolina is the opposite of every U.S. state because it is every U.S. state, compressed until the contradictions can't be ignored. Thanks for watching. Check out the videos on screen for more and subscribe if you haven't already.